Welcome to our financial topic presentation on the student loan crisis. The student loan crisis is a phrase we've all heard many times in recent years. American student loan debt has reached close to $1.5 trillion, surpassing the national credit card debt and all other categories of non-housing consumer debt. Today, on average, American undergraduates leave college with $35,000 in student loans, more than double what it was a decade ago. So what has caused this massive increase in student loan debt? According to Best & Best, the current student loan mess is a result of several student loan problems occurring over the past several decades. These suggest the student loan crisis is the cause of quote-unquote good intentions gone awry. And note that it's important to understand how we arrived at the current state of affairs to best avoid further student loan crises. In this part of our presentation, we will explain how various events, legislative measures, and increased costs have brought us to the current state of affairs in the student loan saga. The GI Bill, enacted in 1944, was the first federal grant program in the United States. It provided federal grants for veterans wishing to enroll in post-secondary institutions and was intended to support the post-war economy. Almost 3.9 million veterans used the GI Bill, and it was one of the most important contributions to the new notions of federal grants for college students. While the GI Bill was limited to veterans, in 1958, the National Defense Education Act, NDEA, was passed. It offered federal financial aid to all college students. An important piece of the NDEA was the National Defense Student Loan Program, later renamed Perkins Loans, which became the first program to target low-income college students. Interestingly, the passage of the NDEA was actually a U.S. governmental plan to regain U.S. primacy during the Cold War and space race. The NDEA initiated federal involvement in student loans, and as a result of this program, the number of students paying for their education with loans increased dramatically. In 1965, the Higher Education Act, HEA, was passed as part of Johnson's Great Society program and was intended to provide financial aid for all but the top 10% of income brackets. The HEA created what would become known as the Pell Grant, Stafford Loan Program, and Federal Work Study. The Stafford Loan Program, also called the Guaranteed Student Loan, i.e. GSL program, caused many future issues by guaranteeing these loans. For example, students received loans from banks and the federal government guaranteed these loans, meaning that taxpayers were responsible for repaying all loans not repaid by students. Therefore, it definitely became problematic when a large percentage of students began defaulting on their loans. In 1972, the Student Loan Marketing Association was established to increase the availability of student loans. This association, more commonly known as Sallie Mae, was created to work similar to how Fannie Mae works with mortgages. With this program, banks loaned money to students, but the loans were sold to Sallie Mae, thereby enabling banks to offload the risk instead of waiting for loan repayments. The Educational Amendment Act of 1972 was also greatly expanded the availability of financial aid. For instance, the Basic Educational Opportunity Grant, BEOG, program was created to distribute federal grants, so now students had even more choices for funding their education. Another major impact of these amendments was the expansion of eligibility criteria for financial aid. The GSL income ceiling increased to $25,000, to the equivalent of $140,000 in today's currency, and all students within this income bracket at any accredited institution, including for-profit institutions, could receive financial aid. Then, in 1978, in response to the depressed economy, MISAA, or the Middle Income Student Assistance Act, was passed, which completely removed this income ceiling. These actions, particularly the passage of the MISAA, significantly increased the amount of student loans. In a 3-year span from 1978 to 1981, the amount of student loans jumped from $2.2 billion to $6.2 billion. This expansion helped launch the high rates of student loan defaults that would be seen in the near future. In the 1980s, the cost of tuition and fees at post-secondary institutions began to increase at a much higher rate than inflation. In the 1970s, about 50% of public institutions' revenue came from the states. But beginning in the 1980s, state funding failed to keep up with increased university budgets. To make up for this loss of revenue, tuition costs rose, thereby requiring most students to use federal financial aid. Also, because institutions were now forced to generate revenue in new ways, institutions began to compete among themselves for students and resources, thus necessitating the marketization of higher education. The 1980s were also an interesting time in the student loan saga because of President Ronald Reagan's belief in a free market economy. He advocated a cost-sharing model for funding higher education, in which full costs were imposed on students capable of paying, and public support was intended for students truly in need. The succeeding Clinton administration sought to reduce the massive profits made by private lenders from federally guaranteed student loans. For instance, by 1990, Sallie Mae was a member of the New York Stock Exchange with assets of $41.4 billion. By 1996, they were privatized and making loans directly to students. There was a lot of debate during this period about the best mode of federal loan delivery. President Clinton wanted to enact a direct government loan program to replace the private or bank-based federal guaranteed loans program. A compromise was adopted by Congress in 1993 in which all universities could choose a direct lending program or a government-guaranteed private student loans. The amount of student loan debt has grown in epic proportions. In 2010, student debt rose to $830 billion, surpassing credit card debt for the first time in American history. As you can see from this graph, the amount of federal financial aid has exponentially increased in recent years. In 2014-2015 academic year, the total aid funding was $161.4 billion, with $95.9 billion, almost 60% of that accounting for loans. These figures illustrate just how dependent American higher education has become on student loans, and with good reason. Interestingly, while college costs have continued to increase, the amount of federal grants students are available to receive have remained almost stagnant for over 50 years. Although the number of Pell Grant recipients have almost quadrupled since 1979, the average amount each student received has not changed. Therefore, to make up for the large gap between the cost of higher education and the amount of federal grants, students have had to turn to loans to finance their education. As a result, loan programs have continued to grow, as have the numbers of students in debt. Again, student debt surpasses credit card debt nationally. With the new decade, the average debt load of students graduating in 2011 was $26,500. About 2/3 of all graduates had student loans, with 1/5 taking out private loans, which typically have higher interest rates. By this time, however, rising college costs and reduced public spending in higher education was not the only contributing factor to this dramatic increase. For-profit college graduates had disproportionate number of students borrowing, and loan amounts were significantly higher. The average enrollments for for-profit institutions increased from 650,000 in 2000 to 2.5 million in 2010. In 2011, 11% of all student loan borrowers were attending for-profit institutions. For-profit institutions account for nearly half of all defaults. Additionally, dropouts were 4 times as likely to default as graduates were, and dropout rates for for-profit institutions is a staggering 60%. Also staggering is the data indicating that the 6-year graduation rate is 23%, compared with 63% for nonprofit institutions. The overall default amount in 2011 was $76 billion, and the federal government spent $1.4 billion on collection agencies to find defaulters. Lower income, first-generation students and students of color are disproportionately hit by the for-profit loan crisis. Students enrolled at for-profit institutions resemble the demographics of community college students. A national discussion ensues about the integrity of student recruitment practices for for-profit institutions. Some ask, are some institutions acting in predatory ways? Are they ethical? Is there a need for regulation? For-profit college sector faced rising regulatory pressure, especially during the Obama administration. Legislation passed allowing for the U.S. Department of Education to increase regulation of for-profit colleges. It sanctions 2 large for-profit chains, Corinthian College and ITT Tech. As a result, both filed for bankruptcy and closed hundreds of campuses across the U.S. Congress also passes the Gainful Employment Regulations, which ensure that higher education institutions graduate students and make them employable in order to receive access to federal financial aid. While these legislative acts reduce the amount of loan default rate, there is a chance that current executive administration could undermine this progress by reducing the regulatory enforcement that Obama established. Although the for-profit institution crisis disproportionately hit lower-income students, the big picture indicates that middle-income families are at the highest risk for incurring student debt. The number of people who have student loan debt at age 60 or older has increased higher than any other age group. This is causing people to defer retirement. Additionally, there is a large emotional toll associated with this debt burden as well.